First of all, just to say very, very much thank you to the campaign for inviting me here to speak today. I've worked with the campaign for, I think it's around about 20 years now. I'm a big fan in all of the work they do, and it's lovely to see some familiar faces, long supporters here as well in the audience today, so thank you very much. Also, I'd like to just say how humbled I feel by our excellent speakers today, and I really hope that I measure up. But it's been a really, really interesting day so far already. So my talk is a fairly short talk, and I will try and grab some time back because we're slightly behind this morning. But a short talk really just sharing some of my experience with you on where it goes wrong in particularly manufacturing environments. To a lesser extent today my talk's about food service, although there is some crossover. But really, where are the key difficult areas, key wake up and worries in manufacturing terms? And one of the issues that I have to tackle fairly regularly when I'm working with manufacturers in this area is actually dealing with the opinions of auditors who come along and raise various non-conformities in relation to the allergen risks that they're seeing. And it's a source of sometimes frustration that very often those non-conformities relate to what manufacturers perceive as quite low-risk areas. So, for example, warehouse areas is a sort of a common gripe, if you like. So really what I'm going to do through the course of this short talk is just give you an insight into perhaps why auditors are raising some of these things, and share with you some tools and best practice really and how to overcome some of those problems. And thinking about some other things too, so the good old spillage kit that I'm sure any of you involved in manufacturing are painfully aware of, and it makes me smile really. I often wonder if 10 tonnes of milk powder falls over a dustpan and brush really going to help us very much with the clean-up. So one of the challenges I think for the food industry actually is auditor training and experience. And it's a very difficult area for auditors, this. Where do you go to get that good quality allergen management training? A lot of it actually is gained through experience. So if you're on the receiving end of audits, it's worth bearing in mind that your auditor probably is feeling their way through this whole subject just as much as you may have done. And that actually is one of the problem areas when we don't give our auditors a feel-good feeling about the allergen situation, and we don't make it easy for them to make judgments on risk. So really what I'm saying is take control of your audit to avoid inappropriate non-conformances being raised, to avoid frustration really. Take control of your audit. And the key to success there, of course, is risk assessment. So my pitfall number one, if you like, where it tends to go wrong in manufacturing environments, both in audit situations and outside audit situations, is risk assessment is weak. It's not detailed enough. It hasn't fully given consideration to what these key risk areas actually are. And it can be difficult to find practical advice and guidance on how to go about risk assessment. I'm quite proud to have helped construct Camden Guide 71, which you can see there, which has a useful toolkit in it for how to approach the subject of risk assessment. And just to say, I don't get commission, so there's no benefit for me if anybody wants to go away and get hold of a copy of that guide after today. I'm mentioning it because it's a useful reference point. I'm not going to talk today about how to risk assess, but if you want more information about that after today, you can have a look in Camden Guide 71. But in essence, what I am saying is that risk assessment is key, and what we're looking for is to risk assess against two very simple but incredibly important criteria. The first is the likelihood of cross-contamination occurring, and the second is the quantity of allergen involved, which is a difficult area in the absence of thresholds, which Claire shared with us in her excellent talk first thing this morning. Without thresholds, we're struggling. So I tend to work to very, very simple common sense principles. I'm looking to see that my level of contamination, if it's there, will be under the limit of detection. In other words, I can't find it if I look for it. And that's in the absence at the moment of reliable thresholds. So it's really encouraging to hear Claire say that we might be seeing some progress in that area. And just on the slide there is just some examples really of typical low risk and high risk areas that I come across in factories. You can see the low risk areas tend to be the storage and dispatch type areas, the areas where there's minimal food contact, minimal handling, any spillage that occurs only really is going to fall onto floors and unopened raw material. By contrast there, the high risk areas, it's all common sense stuff this really, but it's the shared equipment. These are very much the areas where the focus should generally be in factory risk assessment programs. It's places where we're actually opening ingredients up, tipping it into equipment. The equipment's effectively becoming dirty. One of the problems I see is that people try and tackle risk assessment. They make a good start, but they're actually quite poor at recording the detail of the risk assessment thought process. This is a really, really important area, both for your own records and to show thoroughness, and also to help explain your thought process to your auditors. I can't stress strongly enough how important it is to keep excellent records of how you determine your risk judgments. I tend to approach it this way. I very clearly describe my likelihood reason and I apply a corresponding score, and then equally work through the corresponding quantity of allergen that could be involved. Again, very much remembering that I'm looking to limit of detection. So the level there in the side of 25 ppm would actually cause concern for me, very much so. This example here, we're looking at, as in the previous slide, at egg. It's just really show you the differences between how the risks arise, and our key risk areas are always going to be the shared equipment. So in the previous slide, if I just go back, the previous slide is talking about a potential airborne contamination risk from one mixer travelling across air to another. And there is a risk there, although it's probably a relatively low one. But what's much higher risk is, again, the shared equipment. It's where we've actually got allergens coming into contact with products from the previous production run. And it sounds like common sense, but very often people's risk assessments aren't clearly showing this and aren't showing that thought process explicitly enough. You can see also what I'm doing in risk assessments is I'm very, very carefully considering the mechanisms by which cross-contamination will occur. There's a certain physicality to this, and this again is very important in managing the opinions and perceptions of other people in terms of what risks actually are. Those of you that have heard me speak before will have heard me say this before, but allergens don't jump and they're not radioactive. So if they're going to get from A to B, there has to be a vector. And my approach to risk assessment is very much to determine and to be very clear about what those vectors actually are in detail. And very often at any given allergy risk point, there'll be 6 or 7 different vectors that you need to think through in terms of how that cross-contamination could occur. And you can see an example behind me there. I'm actually being very clear about how egg could get from one basket of food to another basket of food. It's not going to merely jump. There has to be a certain set of circumstances in place for that to actually occur. You can see my definitions here. They're very common sense. There's various permutations on these sorts of models. I'm sure that you've all worked with examples of your own, but I'm very much applying a very, very common sense guide, and I keep coming back to it. I'm very much working to the limit of detection. So if I can look for it and find it, no matter how much, at the moment for me, that is going to be a problem. And there you've got a summary of the overall risk matrix. So to move on then to pitfall number 2, and coming out of risk assessment then, the second big problem I see is people actually trying to make controls really way too complicated, trying to achieve too much by procedure and training and getting people to remember things, and you see walls plastered in wallpaper of allergen signage, which people become quite blasé to after a while. So I always say to people, actually, in many senses, the best allergen control is actually no control. And what I mean by that is that the allergen best practice falls in within the day-to-day best practice. So you're not asking people to remember to do extra things. You're merely teaching them one consistently good way of working that includes all all the aspects that are relevant to allergens as well. That actually can be particularly useful in a food service environment, particularly where you're dealing with, as Richard mentioned, a lot of temporary staff coming and going. You very much want a very, very clear embedded culture for people to follow, very, very simple rules for them to get right. And in factories, we see it going wrong fairly regularly because people struggle to remember the rules. So in this example here, we're looking at a colour coding scheme for different allergens. For example, red buckets are for, I can't even read my own slide here, it's all shiny. You'll have to bear with me. Yellow buckets for mustard mayonnaise, green buckets for tuna, blue buckets for everything else. But straight away we see the colour coding breaking down. And we've now got mayonnaise in 2 locations with 2 different coloured buckets. It's just a very classic example of how the more you get people to try and remember, the more likely it is that they'll actually trip up and forget. And this is quite an interesting slide. One of the things that many people feel they should do or are asked to do by auditors is wear additional protective overclothing when they're handling allergens. In actual fact, when you risk assess this, it's often a relatively low risk aspect in terms of the actual physicality around the cross-contamination. However, what additional protective overclothing can do is give people that mindset. It's that trigger that I'm doing something a bit different now. So sometimes we use controls as a psychological tool more than to address an actual cross-contamination risk. So moving on to pitfall number 3 then, in my hit list if you like. And this is all to do with validation of cleaning and how easy or difficult it is to get cleaning right. It's a very interesting area. I often find that the surfaces that look the most difficult end up being actually quite straightforward to clean or carry much less contamination than you might expect. And conversely, ones that look very straightforward, like a mixing bowl, a lovely stainless steel surface that you think would be very easy to clean, actually proves to be a bit more of a challenge. The difficulty we see with this is that people actually are very bad, in my experience, at properly validating their cleaning. They will tend to want to use rapid test kits to validate, which is a really bad idea. As Claire mentioned, they are qualitative, not quantitative, and it's absolutely essential in our piece of risk assessment work that we really do know exactly how much allergen contamination is there. Merely knowing it's there or not is incredibly unhelpful and can lead you to make some quite serious errors of judgment. So we're looking for laboratory-based validation. Laboratory-based ELISA or perhaps other methods as they come along downstream. What we need to be very clear about is actually what it is that we're validating. And what I'm saying to people really regularly when I visit them is what you are validating is the cleaning method. Just let's get that very straight in your head. You're validating a cleaning method. So everything about that method needs to be recorded when you conduct the validation. Otherwise, it's a potentially useless exercise. And often when I talk to people, they say, yes, we've done the test and we passed and here's the certificate. But what did you validate? Well, we just cleaned, but no record about actually what was cleaned and how it was cleaned and who did it and were you watching them, etc. Robust records of validation are incredibly important. What you are validating is the clean. And often it goes wrong. It can be very difficult to get the cleaning right, but usually it's just about doing it better. There's no secrets here. It's use better chemicals, use more elbow grease, use more cleaning stages. In most situations I come across, it is actually possible to get cleaning for allergens right. There are usually only a few situations where it can't be achieved, and we have no option but to apply a may contains warning statement. It's remarkable what can be achieved in most manufacturing environments. So that then leads into my 4th manufacturing pitfall, which that's all very well then. So you validate a cleaning method, you know that cleaning method will work. In a sense, that's the easy part. The hard part then is to make sure that every time that cleaning is carried out, it's carried out following exactly the validated method. And this is the bit that would keep me awake at night if I were running a food factory or indeed a catering premises. It's how will you know how much verification is required? If you're a technical manager, a production manager, how will you know every time that cleaning was done, it was done to the required standard by the appropriately trained people? Otherwise, how will you sleep at night? So this can spin out of your risk assessment. From your risk assessment, you will identify the precise key cleaning risk points that need validating. Those validated risk points then need to be subject to ongoing verification. So every risk point you identify should have corresponding, very prescriptive controls. And each one of those controls should be subject to some form of verification. That verification doesn't need to involve testing necessarily, so whilst validation must involve testing to be done effectively, verification doesn't necessarily need to involve testing, but at the very least it should be a visual check of every key cleaning risk point every time that cleaning is done. And I sometimes advise people to keep photographic evidence of those checks as well in case there is any comeback on them. So I've just shown you an example there of how control and verification links into my risk assessment. So from my risk assessment process, I come out with an overall risk score. I can then identify what controls are required to address that specific risk point. And finally, then in my verification column, as a manager, I will know exactly how I'm going to verify that control point every time that activity is being undertaken. I'm going to move on now to pitfall number 5, and this is very much in tune with the theme of today, I think, as well as communication. This is a really, really important area, actually. I worked with a client recently who started finding traces of egg in a product. It was a kind of vegetarian beef burger type of product. They were finding egg in it, and they instantly assumed that the egg contamination was a result of surface contamination from the previous production run. But they did some surface testing and were able to prove that link. But then they began to look at raw materials and investigate what happened with suppliers. And actually it turned out that they were buying an ingredient from a supplier who had a breakdown and chose to run the production on a different machine. And that machine ran egg on it, whereas the usual machine didn't run egg. And there had been no communication process around that from the shop floor up to the management team. So the result was a fairly difficult situation for my clients and a potentially quite serious cross-contamination risk. So communication is absolutely key to this, and I think the words I would use really would be fail-safe communication, and that's as important in a food service situation as it is in a manufacturing situation. And of course, by far the biggest risk area in the food service communication chain is the communication, obviously, between front and back of house, which is where I see most potential for problems. My second key risk area then, pitfall 6 if you like, is supplier controls, which again has been touched on today. It's almost another whole talk in itself, but very, very difficult area to understand what's actually happening in your supply base. And I tend to find two spectrums of difficulty, really. I have suppliers who just completely underestimate the risk and tell me everything's fine. And on the opposite side, I have suppliers that say, we can't guarantee anything is free from anything. And really, it's trying to find that middle ground between the two. And what I suggest to people, advise people to do, is just ask loads and loads of questions. This is the secret to success here. What you want to establish is what your supplier doing compatible with what your finished product is. You're looking for compatibility. I call it playing allergen dominoes. Do the spots on your suppliers' allergen dice match yours? And if they don't, so if they're using an allergen that is of importance to you in free from or absence terms, then ask loads of questions and use the answers to those questions to help you judge the actual risk in that situation. So you want to know things like how often they handle the allergen of concern. Is it made on the same line as your product? Have they they done any validated cleaning work, and so on. So it's really pinning them down and getting good quality information out of them that then help you to judge what the actual risk is going to be and then determine what your next steps are going to be. And ultimately, that probably would need to be auditing if you have serious concerns about cross-contamination risks. But I fairly regularly find some quite serious, well, it's actually really a communication again, it's communication gaps between what we need to have in our finished product specification and what the supplier's understanding of that actually is. I could give you some case studies, but to save time and catch up a bit today, I'll actually just carry on. So I'm going to come back to my first question then, really, at the start of this short session, is the warehouse actually one of the lowest risk areas in the factory? So it's often raised as a non-conformance area in audits by auditors. And, well, actually, in terms of physical cross-contamination risk, material getting from where it should be to where it shouldn't be, it is actually a very low-risk place. But actually, the far bigger risk, and what turns it into a high-risk place, is the risk of mispick errors. It's picking the baking powder that has gluten in it for the gluten-free product, not the gluten-free one, which can be quite easy to do. So whilst many people risk assessing, and perhaps auditors will say we should keep ingredients separate in the warehouse to avoid cross-contamination, actually by far the bigger risk is making sure that we can very, very readily and quickly, in an idiot-proof manner, identify those ingredients. That is the most important thing. And if physical segregation helps with that identification, then so be it. But actually, it's not to prevent the cross-contamination from the milk to the flour or whatever. So other key problem areas, I've given you my kind of top 6 or 7, but where it really goes wrong in factories, do you know what? We're actually really good at preventing cross-contamination in food manufacturing. We do a pretty good job of it most of the time, a very high level of awareness and very high level of motivation to get it right. And still where it tends to go wrong, and I'm sure that you've all seen examples like this, it's our labelling and packing errors. It's the wrong product going into the wrong pack. 2 or 3 examples for you here. So this is to do with FIR. It's to do with items not being highlighted in bold or whatever on the finished pack copy. And here again we've got a missing allergen on the label. So where it's going wrong in factories, it's going wrong because of gross labelling errors, usually at pack copy sign-off stage, or it's going wrong because of gross errors at the point of packing on the production line. It's wrong product going into wrong pack. They are still the key areas for us and still the ones that do require that higher level of attention to stop some of these costly and damaging public recalls. And we'll have questions later on, I think. Yes, okay.
Thank you very much.